Hey guys, thanks for joining me today. My name is Guy Britton and I'm a mix engineer and a producer. In today's video, we're going to be looking at what's on my mix bus. Now, I'm a big fan of top-down mixing, so I like to do a lot of work on the buses and the subgroups in my mix, particularly on the master bus. I feel like it helps me to shape the mix in a certain way and just get to an end result a lot quicker. So today we're going to be looking at how I implement this into my mixes. I'll break down exactly what's going on my mix bus, and I'll show you how I'm using this to affect the sound in certain ways, and most importantly, why I'm doing that. So let's jump in and take a look at what's going on. So the track we're working with today is a track called Radioactive by Kate Lomas, which is a song that I produced and mixed. I'm going to play it back and I'll show you what it sounds like with and without the master bus processing.
Flooding like an overdose, tell us what we need to know. A little uncontrollable, eyes closed, ready for the baby. I wonder if we all need saving, 'cause life's got bigger than a daydream. Maybe we're radioactive.
So you can hear how much difference that master bus processing is making. You know, without it, the mix just sounds flat and kind of lifeless. And when I turn it on, the mix is really popping and it comes alive. So let's break down what's going on here. The first thing to mention is that there's quite a lot of talk about whether or not you should be mixing into these plugins from the beginning. So turning them all on and, you know, building your mix with all the plugins on, or whether you should be, you know, adding them at the end as if you're mastering. For me, I kind of do a bit of both. So I tend to start with these first 4 plugins. Once I've built a mix, kind of built the balance of the mix and shaped it, done some corrective EQing and just kind of got an overall vibe for the mix, then I'll turn these plugins on and I'll be mixing into them for pretty much the whole mix. And then I'm just adding these next plugins as I go, depending on what the mix needs. And then I've just got a bit of finalizing going on here. But we'll get into this later on. So the first plugin in the chain is the Slate VMR virtual mix bus plugin. Now, I'm not like massive on virtual console emulation and so on. I don't have it across the whole mix, but I do like it on the mix bus, and I will use it on some of the subgroups from time to time. I feel like this Brit end setting, the Neve console emulation, just adds a bit of low end, a bit of top end, and just adds something really subtle to the mix that I quite like. So let's take a listen to what that's doing.
Flooding like an overdose, tell us what we need to know. A little uncontrollable, eyes closed, ready for the baby. I wonder if we all need saving.
So as I say, it's super subtle, but you'll notice that with most of these plugins that are on the mix bus, all of these individual changes are really subtle, and then it's kind of the sum of all those subtle changes that makes the difference. Like I say, I'm hearing like a little bit of a bump in the low end and maybe just in the top end a touch, but this is so subtle that it's barely noticeable. But when we come to the end and I turn all the plugins off, you know, you really notice the difference. So next up in the chain is the Slate FGMU. You'll see a lot of these plugins on my mix bus, Slate digital plugins. I just really love what they do. And, you know, I'm not being paid to say that. I just think they sound really good. This is a emulation of the Fairchild compressor. This is not doing a lot of compression. When I play it back, you'll see the needle is barely moving, but it adds like kind of a mid-range presence to it for me in the upper mids, and just, you know, helps the mix kind of liven up a little bit. So let's take a listen to what that's doing.
Flooding like an overdose, tell us what we need to know. A little uncontrollable, eyes closed, ready for the baby. I wonder if we all need saving, 'cause life's got bigger than a daydream. Maybe we're radioactive. Baby, make my heart go racing.
Again, super subtle, but it does add a bit of a bump in the kind of upper mids and the top end, which I think adds a life to the mix. And, you know, I like what that's doing early on. So already the mix is sounding a little bit better. Let's just hear what it sounds like with those 2 plugins bypassed.
Flooding like an overdose, tell us what we need to know. A little uncontrollable, eyes closed.
So it feels like there's a bit more energy coming into the mix already. And this is a good start. So next up in the chain, we have the BX Townhouse compressor from Plugin Alliance, which is like an SSL compressor emulation. I really like this plugin. I think it sounds great. And it's kind of noisy at times, like, you know, in a quiet mix, it does add a bit of noise that you can hear, but I like what it does to the mix. I don't like to say, I hate the term like it glues the mix together, but it does do something to make the mix more cohesive. So you'll see the settings I'm using, quite a slow attack, 10 milliseconds, super fast release, 2:1 ratio. So, you know, it's really soft compression. And let's hear what that's doing.
Flooding like an overdose, tell us what we need to know. A little uncontrollable, eyes closed, ready for the baby. I wonder if we all need saving, 'cause life's got bigger than our daydreams. Maybe we're radioactive. Baby, make my heart go racing.
Cool, so we're starting to bring some energy to the mix now. Part of the mix bus compression is that what it's doing is, you know, it's kind of squeezing the mix together a little bit more and pulling a little bit more energy out of the mix. And yeah, so I like what this compressor is doing. Like I say, again, it's subtle, but you know, as we add it all up together, it's going to make a big difference. So next up in the chain is the Shep 73 EQ from Waves. This technique is actually a technique that I stole from Andrew Sheps himself. I think I watched a video on him talking about this technique, and I think it adds a lot. I'm actually just using the Mix, Widen and Focus preset, which is in the preset menu. And what this does is this switches the EQ to run in mid-side mode rather than stereo mode where it would default to. And what that means is that we can now control the sides of the mix differently to the middle of the mix. So in this case, we've got the M here. This strip of EQ is affecting the middle. S, this side strip, is affecting the sides of the EQ. The sides of the mix, sorry. And what we're doing here is just boosting 3 dB at 12K, but only in the left and right, not in the middle. So what that does is that makes the sides of the mix brighter than the middle of the mix and kind of gives the illusion that the mix is wider. And then we're just bumping a little bit of low end down the middle as well. So let's take a listen to what that's doing.
Flooding like an overdose, tell us what we need to know. A little uncontrollable, eyes closed, ready for the baby. I wonder if we all need saving, 'cause life's got bigger than our daydreams. Maybe we're radioactive. Baby, make my heart go racing. Give me anything.
So you can hear that adds a lot of width to the track. In this track in particular, most of the sides is BVs and percussion and, you know, some kind of effects tails and so on. And this really helps to bring that up and you just make that a bit more present. So if we just take a listen to the drums, for example, in this case, you'll hear what I mean. We have that offbeat hi-hat, which is really being boosted by this EQ, makes the drums feel a little bit wider, but it also does the same thing to the BVs as well, and everything that's on that left and right. And this is a really cool technique for just making the mix feel a lot bigger. So what I was saying earlier about having different stages to the mix bus processing, you'll see that now I've kind of finished this first stage. So this is usually like the beginning of the mix, maybe the first 15, 20 minutes of the mix I use to shape a balance, and then I'll put these 4 plugins on, and I'll be working the whole mix now with these 4 plugins on all the time. And then as we start to go and the mix is a bit more developed is when I start to add these following plugins. So the next plugin in the chain is the API 560 graphic EQ from Waves. This is really not doing much at all other than just dipping 1 dB out at 2K. I like a graphic EQ on the mix bus more than like a parametric EQ, because I feel like, you know, if I just bring up a regular old parametric EQ here, you can start to do a bit too much damage by carving things out, like, you know, different kind of cues and different you know, scooping things out and so on. In some cases where you really need to be specific, then, you know, a parametric EQ is much better. But I think on the mix bus where I'm just trying to make kind of broader moves, I always find that the graphic EQ tends to sound a bit more natural. So in this case, like I said, I'm just dipping out about 2K by about 1 dB. And I guess that's just to kind of tame a bit of harshness from the snare and from the vocal. If we take a listen to that, you'll see that it's probably not really that audible, but it's doing it anyway.
A little uncontrollable, eyes closed, ready for the baby. I wonder if we all need saving, 'cause life's got bigger than our daydreams. Maybe
So you can hear if I just sweep that up and down that it's quite a sort of musical sounding cut or boost depending on what I want to do. Which is why I like the graphic EQ more so than, like I say, a parametric EQ. So that's just doing, 1 dB. It's not a huge amount, but let's take a listen to what these plugins so far have done to the mix, on and off.
A little uncontrollable, eyes closed, ready for the baby. I wonder if we all need saving.
You can hear there that the mix feels a lot more present and a lot more energetic already. We're only halfway through the chain, so let's move to the next plugin, which is another Slate Digital plugin. It's the Iosis, I think that's how you say it. It's how I'm going to say it, the Iosis Air EQ. And we're just boosting the top end a bit here and cutting out some low end. You can use any EQ for this really, but I quite like this one. This one just lives on my master bus. I don't really use it for anything else. What I do like is this strength control, which is quite useful for just sort of, affecting the overall mix quite quickly, turn that up or down. We have this fire water thing, which I don't even know what that does, but I've just left it at neutral. And yeah, so I've just got a high shelf, boosting a little bit, cutting a bit of low end. And let's take a listen to what that's doing.
A little uncontrollable, eyes closed, ready for the baby. I wonder if we all need saving. 'Cause life's got bigger than our daydreams. Maybe we're radioactive. Baby, make my heart go racing. Give me anything worth chasing. 'Cause maybe we're radioactive.
So for me, that adds quite a lot of air to the vocal. Like those backing vocals in particular now feel a little bit dreamier with that EQ on. And also there's quite a lot of weight in that low end in the kick drum and the bass. And it's just helping to just dial a little bit of that out because I feel like it was perhaps getting a little bit too heavy in the low end. So yeah, I feel like it's subtle, but it's quite effective and it just adds a bit more air to the top end. And just, just cuts out a little bit of that low end. So let's hear that one more time.
Baby, I wonder if we all need saving. 'Cause life's got bigger than our daydreams. Maybe we're radioactive.
It's just helping open up that top end a bit more, add a bit more clarity to the mix. And I like what that's doing. So next up in the chain is the FabFilter Pro MB, just some multi-band compression. And all this is doing is just affecting this mid band here from about 700 hertz up to about 3.5K. And then some low end as well, some compression on the low end. What this is doing, the mid band is really just controlling some of that harshness. I feel like the snare and the vocal at times get a little bit harsh, and this just helps to smooth that out a touch. So let's take a listen to what that's doing.
Eyes closed, ready for the baby. I wonder if we all need saving. 'Cause life's got bigger than our daydreams. Maybe we're radioactive. Baby, make my heart go racing. Give me anything worth chasing. 'Cause
So it's subtle, but it's just helping to control that mid-range a bit, make it a little bit more consistent, and the same with the low end. At times, especially when the vocals come up, that mid-range can jump out a little bit too much. So this multi-band compression is just helping us to control that, and just an extra stage of compression there. So again, subtle, but it's just quite effective in just dealing with a very specific part of the mix. So next up in the chain is the VTM Virtual Tape Machine from Slate Digital. I really like what this plugin does to a mix. It's just adding some saturation and making the mix a little bit more cohesive, a little bit more energetic. We're running at 30 inches per second on the half-inch 2-track tape, and then with this tape type down the bottom. I'm also taking, you'll notice there's this bass alignment setting. If we go into the settings in this plugin, there's this bass alignment thing. Now when it's set at 0 dB, I feel like it actually adds quite a lot of bass and quite a lot of low end. So I always just try and cut this out a little bit so that we're not adding too much extra low end to the mix, because this plugin can make the mix a little low end heavy, which sometimes is great, sometimes it's a bit too much. So in this case, I'm just dialing a bit of that out. Let's take a listen to what that's doing.
Eyes closed, ready for the baby. I wonder if we all need saving. 'Cause life's got bigger than our daydreams. Maybe we're radioactive.
Cool. So that's adding quite a lot of energy to the mix. It makes the mix feel wider to me, a bit more exciting, and just adds a bit more life to the mix. So yeah, really love this plugin on the MixBus. I also will use this across other buses and even individual tracks at occasions. Yeah, really love this plugin. So next up is another instance of Virtual Mix Rack. This time I'm using the Custom Series Lift EQ and Slate Revival, which is like a harmonic exciter. I've actually got a video on this, using this on vocals, which you can check out on my channel. But in this case, we're just using this to bump up some of the top end in the mix. So I have this set to present mode. I feel like this affects sort of like the 7 to 10K area. If we set it to silky, I think it adds, it's boosting more in sort of the 10K plus area to my ears anyway. And then we have the revival, which, as I say, is just a harmonic exciter. These things are set super subtle, but this does make quite a big difference to the mix. So let's take a listen to each one on and off.
Eyes closed, ready for the baby. I wonder if we all need saving. 'Cause life's got bigger than our daydreams. Maybe we're radioactive. Baby, make my heart go racing. Give me anything worth chasing. 'Cause maybe we're radioactive.
So you can hear, like a lot of the stuff on the MixBus, this is quite subtle. Perhaps this one's a little bit more obvious, but what this is doing is just opening up that top end, adding a bit more clarity, a bit more air, and allowing those percussive parts to cut through a bit more, and for those vocals to kind of breathe a bit more, I feel. And yeah, I really like this. I really like these two on the MixBus, but you don't need too much. If you push it too far, then it just becomes too bright and a bit too shiny. So it's important to make sure that, you're not kind of going too wild with these. And like I say, you don't have to use these particular plugins, not just in this stage, but across all these stages. You don't need these specific plugins. I just really like these for doing this particular part of the mix. So last up in the chain, I say last up because this single band EQ is literally just doing some automation at the beginning and the end of the mix. It's not really doing anything other than that. It's just a creative thing more than part of my MixBus. But what we do have is this Celestial Master Bus processor from Acoustica, I believe. Now, I don't know where I got this plugin from. I don't remember getting this plugin, but one day I found it in my plugin folder and I've not stopped using it since. I think it's modeled on the SSL Fusion. It looks like the SSL Fusion. And basically, it's kind of like a channel strip processor for the whole master bus. You can use this in mastering or, on the MixBus. It has this drive section here, which adds some harmonics. And then we have this EQ section, this filter section, which I'm not actually using, and the compressor, which I'm not actually using. This compressor only affects the top end, or I say the top end, like everything from 3K upwards. But I'm not using it here. And then we have this sort of widening dimension part at the end, which is really cool. I think this is really effective. The one thing to say about this plugin is it is a bitch on your CPU. So I tend not to use it until the very end of the mix. I'm using a 2018 Mac Mini, which usually handles it fine, but my older MacBook just will not use this plugin. It does not like it, particularly in a busy mix. It's fine if I'm just like mastering or something, but in a mix, yeah, it's proper CPU heavy. But nonetheless, I think it sounds really cool and it's worth it for me at the end of a mix. I just like it to finalize it. So let's take a listen to what this is doing. What I will do is I'm just going to turn these stages off and we'll go through each stage individually so we can hear what it's doing. And yeah, check this out.
Bloody like an overdose, tell us what we need to know. A little uncontrollable, eyes closed, ready for the baby. I wonder if we all need saving. 'Cause life's got bigger than our daydreams. Maybe we're radioactive. Baby, make my heart go racing. Give me anything worth chasing. 'Cause maybe we're radioactive. Flooding like an overdose, tell us what we need to know. A little uncontrollable, eyes closed, ready for the baby. I wonder.
There we go. Scrapping out the master bus, but you can hear that dimension thing is really cool because it adds a bit of width to the mix. I'll just play that back again.
Flooding like an overdose, tell us what we need to know.
Cool. So that's just adding the final stage. And yeah, just adding that last bit of spice to the mix that I think is really effective. Like I say, I'll just show you if I bring up my CPU here, like if I play this back, or sorry, if I bypass this and play the mix. Like that's not too bad. You know, we're using quite a lot of processing, but we're not really kind of maxing it out. But then I turn this plugin on. So yeah, it's CPU heavy, but I like what it does, and you know, it's not really an issue. Occasionally we'll get the odd bug like we did just now, but generally speaking, you know, it's not too bad, and I really like it, so great. Okay, so let me just play that back and I'll turn the plugins on and off one more time and you can hear what a difference that's made. Cool, so massive difference between what we started with and what we ended up with. Worth also just saying that this on this stereo out, this plugin is not anything other than an analyzer, the Hoffa IQ analyzer, which I really love. Has some really cool features worth checking out. I might even do a video on this at some point because it has some really great features. But yeah, this is not affecting the sound in any way. It's literally just an analyzer. So just to recap, what we have is some console emulation at the first stage of the mix. The FG-MU just adding kind of a bit of presence and a bit of bite, not really doing any compression. The BX Townhouse compressor, which is doing the master bus compression. And then we have Shep 73 EQ, just adding some width on this mid-side mode. A little mid-cut with the API 560, some boost in the top end and some cutting in the low end from the IOSIS Air EQ. Some controlling of the mid-range with the F Pro MB from FabFilter. And then we have some virtual tape machine, some virtual mix rack just to bump up that top end and, you know, add a bit of airiness to it. And then this Celestial Master Bus processor to just finalize that whole mix. And then, like I say, this single EQ is just literally doing some filtering at the beginning and the end of the mix. Cool, so hopefully that was useful. Hopefully that's maybe given you some ideas about how you can shape your mix using Master Bus processing. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me a comment below. Leave a thumbs up if you like this video and subscribe, and hopefully see you soon.